Yeah, so I'll give just like a brief introduction for anyone that's like new or that hasn't joined before, just to kind of recap what we've, a bit of like what we've done so far. I'm going to share, let's see, this one. Okay, so everyone should be able to, let me see if I can. Perfect. Okay. So if maybe Austin, you could confirm, can you see this browser window with these 3 tabs?
Yep, I can see it.
Okay, great. All right. So just a quick recap. Last week, we ended up talking a bit about sort of like some general programming tools. We talked a little bit about using Git and source control. We talked a little bit about using the terminal to access certain like developer-oriented utilities, to edit files, to change some things about our computer or run applications. And we talked a little bit about the shell, which is an environment that we can find on our computers that has a number of different tools and access an interface for our computer that isn't graphical, like these windows here. So yeah, that's what we talked about a bit. This week, I hope to talk about the DOM, which is the Document Object Model. And this is a continuing conversation on the web infrastructure and web technologies. But that doesn't mean that you're expected to know any of these technologies coming into this session right now. I'm hoping that I can be clear enough that even if you don't have the full context, you can kind of understand what's going on. So if you need some clarification, feel free to stop me, but I'm going to go ahead and kind of go from here. Just again, to reiterate, like I've done in the past, but if you haven't seen this before, this is a link to a sort of project website that I have created for this course specifically, which can be found on GitHub at this URL. It's a handful of resources that I've collected as we sort of worked through material. And I find a lot of these resources useful, and ideally you can too. They could help you build a website. They could help you look at other examples for how tools are built using the web. I also have links here so that you can sign up for my office hours, which I hold every week, as opposed to this course, which is only every other week. And then some information about Git. So just to cover that and get that out of the way.
And I would just like to add that if anybody at any point has any questions, no matter what the question is, please feel free to interject. We are all beginners. We are, except for Paige, we are all learning as people who have very little understanding. So I'm sure if you have a question, we are also probably wondering the same thing. So please, at any time, ask any questions or ask for any elaboration on any topic or detail.
Yeah, no, that's definitely good to get that clarification right now, because you know, later you won't have the same context, and you know, it might be a little bit difficult to get to me or something like that in like an office hours, or you'll have to wait till office hours or something like that. So always happy to stop and clarify things. You know, we're not in a rush at all. You know, the point of this is so that everyone learns. To get started, and I already gave a brief review, I just want to you know, articulate a couple of things that we talked about, but just to reiterate them. In this, you know, series of courses, we're talking about web technologies. So technologies that everyone uses to build web pages. and technologies that are used by browsers to show us web pages when we want to access them. So web technologies are in use right now to load this page that you're seeing here, and to allow me to navigate around to other pages. Here I have some links. So if I click one of these links, it takes me to a different website on a different page. This is a core like web technology. So we've talked a little bit about this before. So this time what I want to talk about is more on the browser side of things, as in like, for instance, this browser is Firefox. So I'm interested today in talking about some of the things that Firefox is going to do behind the scenes, or some of the things that maybe Firefox or any browser uses to build your web page. So that kind of brings us to the document object model, or the DOM. So I'm going to use this inspector tool to kind of get us started here. The inspector tool is accessible, again, for everyone using a browser. To get there, you might have seen what I did. I just right-click pretty much anywhere on a page, and I can click Inspect Element, and this inspector tool should pop up in one way or another. So in so many words, what we're actually seeing right here is what I've been talking about. So the DOM. So, you know, DOM as in document.
What's that acronym for?
Yeah, it's an acronym for the document object model. The document object model is the way that the browser sort of represents your page when it reads your HTML and possibly your JavaScript and your CSS. So it's going to look at those files that you've put together for your particular web page. So your HTML, you know, looks a lot like this, as we talked about before. But for anyone joining now, you know, this is HTML syntax right here. These tags, which are started with this, like these less than symbol brackets here, and closed with this other group here. So this would be HTML, and this is in a separate file that I've saved and that we're loading with this particular web page. So if I go to where my code is stored, you can think of this kind of like a Dropbox or something like that for code files. So if I go here, I think it might have been in resources. So it's loading this web page right here, this helpful links HTML, and this is the source code for this page. So if we remember that this is the HTML code right here. What the browser is doing is it's building what's called a document object model that it will reference when rendering your web page. You can think of the document object model as kind of like a map, like a very generic map that the browser can use to understand where certain things go, what items belong to maybe like a parent item. Like you could think of these little lists as like children of this larger list. So these relationships that we kind of understand, maybe I'd use the word like semantically, as in like the fact that this is like a sub item, it's indented, this has like meaning for us, and this meaning is represented in the document object model. It's not very easy to look exactly at, whoops, I went back. It's not very easy to look exactly at the document object model, but what we can do is we can sort of, we have some helpful resources that can kind of allow us to visualize it.
So whenever you're interacting with a website, you're interacting with a DOM.
Yes, that's right. Yeah,
So every
100%.
website is also a document object model.
Oh, can you repeat that?
So then is every website also a document object model?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. The document object model it doesn't necessarily constitute the website completely, because a website is many many other things too. So there is potentially, like on this website, there might be some other JavaScript code and network requests, as in like pieces of code that can go fetch data from other locations aside from where we are on this website. There's other things going on that don't necessarily get shown on the the website as we see it, as in like the page. Really, what's within this document object model is actually, this puts it really well, represents all page content as, I'm going to try to, yeah, represents all page content as objects that can be modified. So it's really just limited to what is on the page. And so I think you can pretty much represent a website with the DOM, but there might be some things that you miss, so you don't get the full picture. And I think this is a good note here. The DOM is kind of like it's kind of like a set of rules or standards that most browsers follow. So this is why, for the most part, if you load a web page in Chrome versus Firefox versus Internet Explorer, you get largely the same web page. And the reason is because of this DOM living standard. So this is basically an active, very particular list of standards for how the browser should build this DOM from our component code. So how does the browser get from here to the DOM? There's a bunch of code within the browser that basically assesses a document like this and says, okay, this is what the DOM will look like. And how does it know to do that? Every browser uses these standards. It conforms to these standards with some tweaks here and there. There's certainly room for kind of variation, and that's why you can go to a page in some browsers and it might look a little bit different, or it might behave a little bit differently. And some of that can be because the browser maybe decides to do the DOM a little bit differently. But like I said, by and large, the reason that we can expect pages to behave pretty much the same way, we can get what we need to get done, is because of this DOM standard, or in large part because of this DOM standard. I am going to stop here actually briefly talking about the DOM. And I want to change context a bit because of this little note here. And in this course series in particular, we haven't talked so much in detail about CSS. And I wanted to take the opportunity to do that in case anyone is interested in it. But then we'll tie it sort of back into the DOM. But if you notice here, it says that there's a separate specification for CSS rules and style sheets. So the DOM really is more focused on representing HTML. And the way that we decide, like the way that the browser would decide how to style or like decorate certain items that we decided to put into our HTML. So for example, this is like a list item here. It's okay if you're not, super familiar with this particular ID, but this is saying that I'm going to have a list of things, and then this is each item in the list. So it's just list item. So I'm telling the browser that, hey, when you build your DOM, include this in there. And when it builds that DOM, oops, let me hide this. When it builds that, let me see. I think I have a nice. Yeah, I have a nice diagram right here. So when it builds that DOM, it's gonna look like this, but more, if you can imagine, in like text format. But when I'm writing code to look at the DOM, like to look at what the browser has decided to represent my page as, it looks something like this tree. So in our example here, this is my HTML code for this page. We have a header, we have a list, we have a sublist here, another sublist. So if I go over here, ours would look something like we'd have a list, and then our sublist, and then we have another list, and then some sublists, and then the content of those sublists might be here, or the individual list items maybe. So, and actually here you can see. I thought they might give us an example of some of the, but that's okay. This is all I'm really trying to convey here, is that if you were ever wondering, like, how do I get from this HTML to something like this? This is the sort of in-between. The DOM is the in-between. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. But I am going to jump back to this link that I had here, which starts to talk about the, I guess you call it like the CSS or the CSOM. I have never heard someone say it out loud. But the DOM is kind of a core representation of the structure of like a web document. But if you notice here, we're not talking about, and in fact, I'm pretty sure, yeah, there's not much to say on this page about style sheets. And that's because style sheets or styles are not necessarily included in this document object model. We need to kind of extend the document object model to something more specific, which is where we get the CSS object model. And this is where we keep all of our like particular CSS attributes. But we use this with the DOM to know what attribute goes with what, and what attributes are what's called inherited, meaning a good example here is like this text is green. But if you look at the source code, this is the CSS code. So here is CSS, this is HTML. I just have them written in the same file. If we look at this here, this says this list item is, I'm coloring it light green. So note here that I only have the class for this particular color on this list item. And we could apply this color in multiple different ways. And I'm going to talk about this in a second, actually, these classes. But
so DOM is exclusively for HTML?
Wait, can you repeat that? Oh, the CSSOM?
DOM is exclusively for HTML, and then CSSOM is exclusively for CSS?
Yeah. You can, I would say more that the CSSOM is exclusively for CSS. I wouldn't go as far to say that the DOM is exclusively for HTML. HTML is essentially what guides the structure of a web page's particular DOM. So each web page has a DOM. It's kind of like a map for a particular web page. But there are other things that can guide the construction of this. Once we get into JavaScript, and if we start learning about JavaScript for the web, you're manipulating the DOM when you do things like, for example, if I wanted to click a button and hide a paragraph of content, I would need to interact with the DOM and manipulate it. So what I'm doing there is actually changing the content, like the HTML content via the DOM, like my map of the web page with JavaScript. So the DOM is more like a
interface.
Yes, yeah, that's a perfect word for it. And the CSS, OM is also an interface. It's just specifically for CSS, but it really doesn't work without the DOM. And we can see the standards for this object model here, just like we have these for the general DOM. We also have standards for the CSS OM. But the CSS OM, to be clear, is just kind of like a really specific object model or map for CSS alone. It doesn't really work well without the DOM. You kind of need the DOM. Yeah, that's a good question. So I was talking just a little bit about inheritance. You can kind of understand this concept here. I know it's a little bit abstract to kind of introduce classes and then introduce all this stuff, but the only principle I really want to convey right here is, notice if I tell you that putting the word class and then an equals and then this keyword here, web resources, which I defined right here. I said if an item has this keyword web resources, color it green. If I told you that putting this class here means that this rule, this CSS style rule, will get applied. Okay, what you might not expect, hopefully you'd expect that it would get applied to this particular item, this list item. But what you might not expect is that since this list item, this one here, which is part of this greater list that you can see is continuing here. So here's the first list item, and we can see this in the code. So here's the first one, second one, third one, which has all my links, and then fourth one here. What you might not expect is that all of the items within it also get this same green coloring, even though if I look at them individually, you notice here I have class web resources on this tag. I don't have it here. This is because of a concept called inheritance. It means that within CSS in particular, and part of where CSS gets its name, cascading style sheets, it means that CSS allows us to specify that items within a parent item will get the same attributes, the same CSS attributes. So in particular, for this one, this class is actually getting applied to all of the items within this, this particular parent item here. So that means that when I refer to any list item with the web resources class, it's actually going to get every single list item within this parent here. But that's a little misleading only because if I changed these to something other than a list item, it would still be green. So it's not because they're list items and then the class's web resources that these get colored green, but rather because this parent has this particular color. And so because of this inheritance, it means all of its children, unless I say otherwise, will also get this color.
So it seems like you defined a rule. The rule is that within this category or like this class, it has to be green. And so these things are nested within that.
Right.
It doesn't matter that it's a list item, just the fact, I mean, it could be anything.
Yes.
But because it's nested within this, the rule kind of applies to it. And so then, so if you were to then put if you were to define that, so if you were to define, can you scroll up a bit to the?
Oh, sure, yeah.
If you were to define, so web resources is defined as light green in the CSS, right?
Right, yes.
So if you were to define some helpful links instead of web resources as light green, then everything would be light green.
Okay, yeah, that's a really good note to point out, and it kind of brings us back to some of the core, I guess, like HTML that we might want to talk about before we get too much deeper into the DOM. So one of the things to note here is that for some helpful links here, this is, and I'm not sure if you meant this, but it is good to clarify. So it's just to note that some helpful links is not HTML per se, but rather it's just text. I could put anything here and, you know, sort of, as far as the HTML is concerned or the browser is concerned, it's not really doing anything different as far as rendering my web page. What would change is if I changed this this tag here, which is wrapped in these brackets. So then specifically, it might look like this is some kind of like parent element because of the way that it's indented. So I've kind of tricked you here in a way because of my poor spacing. But if we look, we'll see that this closing tag is on the same line as the opening tag. We call this an opening tag if it just has this less than and then greater than sign. And then the closing tag always has this /. Because of that, there are no other elements enclosed within this particular element, which means that this has no child elements. And all of the other elements on this page are actually siblings. So I think that's important to note because one, it helps us understand how to create children. So to create a child, I'd need to put other elements inside of this, this open tag here. And then you'll see where I close it off is, again, very poorly spaced or indented. It's not very obvious, but it's actually here is where this one ends.
So then in order to make everything light green, you would have to define it within I guess it would be line 22.
Yeah, line 22, yeah. So this would be a great place to do that because most of my page content is contained within a list. So, and we can kind of trace some of this stuff. So some helpful links, that's right here. Okay, and then the remaining content is kind of shown nicely by these bullets, is all within a list. So this is a list item, this is a list item, this is a list item. So Austin is absolutely right. If I were to move this class, and this is called a class when I reference it with this period, you'll notice I don't reference these others with periods because they are HTML element references. So this is an element reference in HTML. I'm saying any list item, any HTML list item that has the class web resources. And a class is just to recap that and clarify it, is pretty meaningless. You give it the meaning that you want it to. There's very few that I can think of, like special keyword classes that will do something that you don't expect just because you name it a certain way. I can name this whatever I want. I just called it web resources because in this particular list, I wanted to put some, web resources. But yeah, so if I were to move this here, if I were to change this from LI to a UL, and then if I were to move this class up to this UL, then yes, everything on this page, except for one thing, which maybe I can let Austin, if you want to guess what that one thing would be, everything will be colored green.
Can you say that again?
Yeah, so if I were to move this class here, this web resources, to the UL, which is an open tag that is again closed here, and I changed this rule to say all UL tags with the class web resources will be colored green. There should only be one element remaining on the page that would not be green.
I think it would be some helpful links.
Yeah, that's correct. Absolutely. Because yeah, this is opened and closed on a separate line, so it doesn't belong to this. So that's the number one thing I want to clarify. And then the number two thing might be that unfortunately, but also if you get into writing your own HTML, it's probably a good thing. White space is a little bit tricky in HTML. And what do I mean by white space? Well, white space, I mean like this. So everything, if I can get a better highlight here. Oops. Everything that's highlighted here, everything in green, that's white space. I imagine you've encountered white space in tons of other places, if you use Microsoft Word or something, and sometimes you get a weird indent or a space or something that you didn't expect. So in code, typically, for most languages, most tools, white space usually doesn't matter. So what does that mean? It means that I can do things that are very confusing, like put this UL, this unordered list. I can indent this to make it look like it belongs, like it's a child of this element here, but it's not. That's actually a lie. So it's kind of a trick because white space is ignored by the browser when it builds your document. So I think the easiest way to see that is we can look at the HTML as it's interpreted by the browser here. So this is Firefox loading the page, which I have written code for here. And if you notice, in its representation of my code, it's ignoring my indenting, right? It's not putting the UL over here. It's putting it as it, sort of conforms to the standard document like building. So it's a little confusing, this window, because it's not the DOM, but it kind of is, because it lets us see things like this down here. So this is kind of like a little mini DOM representation right here. So it's showing us that the list item, kind of like our tree view that we have here. So this list item belongs to this unordered list, and it lets us navigate it too, which is pretty nice. So if we go, let's go all the way down to like the very bottom, or like the deepest one that we have, which looks like it's going to be like this link here. So if we go down, when I say to the bottom, I mean like what is the sort of deepest ancestor. It's a little confusing terms because I'm not sure how familiar you might be with that, but it's a good way to look at it here in this list form. Actually, it's kind of convenient because just the way that the browser renders lists automatically, it adds these spaces. So if you write up a list in HTML, it's going to add this spacing just because that's what this HTML standard says to do. That's what it tells the browser to do. It says, hey, if you ever load a list, go ahead and put this space here. So we can kind of tell what the like deepest element is, as in like what's the most nested. Maybe that's a good way to put it. And so we can kind of walk our way up this little tree. So this A tag, which is a link, belongs to a list item, which is here. I don't really like that one. I'm gonna inspect this one because I think it's actually deeper. Yeah, okay, this one's pretty deep. So that's pretty cool. Okay, so this A, which is a link, belongs to this list item here. So we can navigate up and you'll see it's gonna highlight each of my steps. So right now it's highlighting the link in particular. So it's underlined as we're used to. And then if I walk up, it's gonna highlight the list item now, which is this whole line. And then we're gonna walk up again, and now it's gonna highlight the list. So this whole list is the parent of the list item. And then if we walk up one more time, our list item for this larger list, which we colored green because of this, this special CSS rule, it's now highlighted. And we can walk up one more and go to the total list, which contains all of these individual list items. And then we can walk up again to the body of our document, which is basically like what is being shown on the page and what is specified within our HTML code. So if you notice, the body is like the biggest or the most containing element. So a quick tip is if you ever want to like apply a style or a particular rule like this one to color green, for example, the quickest way to do that is apply it to the body. And we can actually kind of do that in this style editor here. Or actually, yeah, we can do that in the style editor. So I can actually modify this code, which you'll recognize as being from our source code here. And I'll go ahead and modify some of this. So let's make, if we wanted to make the whole, oh, sorry, go ahead, Austin.
There is a question from Gina. It's in the chat.
Okay. Let's check that out. Or actually, okay, great. I can see it.
I don't know if you.
Oh yeah, no, I can see it now. Yeah. Okay, so Gina says, so all CSS needs to be defined at the beginning as indicated by the open style and closed style tags. And to answer that question, yes, if you want to include it in the same source code as your HTML, this is the way that we would want to start writing CSS, is through these style tags. So that is correct. However, it does not have to always be at the beginning. It's typically preference that it is at the beginning, but some people will put it in what's called the head here. That's kind of also at the beginning. But some people also put it in what's called like the footer of an HTML document. And then, of course, the other alternative is to put it in a document all by itself, in which case you would reference it with a separate tag. We can go ahead and do that. In fact, let's give that a try, just to kind of show that, because I think it's an interesting idea. And then I will go ahead and answer your second question. So Gina said, can you override the CSS in the rest of the coding ad hoc if needed? Or will the CSS dominate? So that's another great point to clarify. And so just to reiterate kind of everything, I did it this way because it's very convenient to look at the code side by side, so I can quickly see the CSS and the HTML. But you don't have to do it this way. You can put this CSS in a separate file with the extension CSS. So So this file is an HTML file, so it has the extension HTML. Your CSS file would have the extension .css. Now, I'll make one of those in a second, and I'll actually remove this CSS so you can see that it in fact is going to be the same. The second part was that I could put this style tag in multiple different places. I could move it to into this head area. I could move it to a separate section after this closing HTML tag here called the footer. I think that's about it. I think that's about as flexible as it gets, but you do, if you want to include it in an HTML file like I've done here, you do have to have these style tags. And for the last question, can you override CSS here? Is this like the end all be all for these rules? You can. That's sort of the implicit meaning with the word cascading as part of our acronym for CSS, so cascading style sheets. So the huge advantage of these cascading style sheets is that these rules that we define cascade, meaning they propagate to other elements that contain them. There's other conditions though around that cascade, that like process. There's standards around when certain rules cascade and propagate. And one way to mitigate them, I'll just actually show you in here using our editor tools that we have in the browser. And just to remind, like everyone has access to these. All you do is right click, click inspect, and it'll pop that up. So I want to take Gina's example and let's sort of see it in practice. So can you override the CSS and the rest of the code ad hoc? So we can do that, and there's a couple of different ways, but I'll show you one way. So one way we can do it is actually on the element itself. So if we go back to the source code here, we can see that I just have these elements. I don't have any what are called attributes on these elements, which is like class. For this A element, the link, which stands for anchor. We have an href attribute, which tells us what what page it should link to. So for list items, I can add an attribute called style, except I'm not going to do it on the source code. What I'm actually going to do it in is the page itself using our tool. So I can just click right into this element here. So see, I'm clicked into it. It's letting me edit it. And if I press space, and I'm going to add this style attribute. I'm going to add an equals, and I'm going to add a quote, which means that I'm going to include some content for this attribute. So let's change or override the color. It's actually making a suggestion for me, which is nice. So all I did was type C, and it knows, okay, I'm going to suggest you're probably going to modify the color. So I'm going to click that. And then I'm going to add a colon. So you might not have seen that because it was kind of quick, but I'm adding this colon here. It's just the same syntax as I would use here, right here. Except you can imagine I've already done this part by putting the style attribute directly on the element itself. So I no longer have to specify this because it knows that's where I am in the document. So now I'm going to add a particular color. I'm going to use a color keyword because it's easy, but you don't have to use color keywords. Let's use this really crazy color I've never heard of, blanched almond. Blanched almond. Oh, okay. That's a little embarrassing. But anyway, you can see that now the color is blanched almond. You can see there's some pretty crazy color keywords, but notice what I've done is exactly what Gina suggested. I've overridden the CSS that we coded in this source code by putting an element-specific style. We can put this into our source code too, just like this. So we could literally copy, oops, if I can get it, I can copy this content, and without clicking a link, and I know I haven't talked too much about this website, but I can actually edit content on this website if I were signed in. I'm not signed in right now, but we don't really have to do it. You can take my word for it, hopefully. Or if you don't take my word for it, hopefully this is clear enough. But basically, if I liked the change I had made, I would go into the source code and I would modify it there. So this is a great piece of knowledge to have, that these CSS rules are basically rules. And you imagine a little rule book that says, okay, every item in the body, I want you to have the font Helvetica. And as we see here, everything wrapped inside of this body, okay, has the same font. It's very clear. And the reason is because of this rule. And where do all these rules and attributes live? Well, for CSS, they live in what we talked a little bit about, which is the CSS object model, which basically collects a map that looks kind of like this, except it's specifically collecting all of these particular CSS rules. A good way to quickly view the CSS object model, by the way, you can navigate through these attributes and you'll notice something populating here on the right. I want you to pay close attention to this. So notice as I navigate through some of these elements, this is changing, okay? And it's talking about some inheritance here. This is actually our CSS object model at work. So what it's doing is saying, I built a CSS object model, and as you navigate the document object model, which this is basically what we're doing, is we're kind of walking through this with our arrow keys. I don't know if that was clear, but I'm just using the arrow keys to kind of like scroll through these attributes or elements, sorry. These are elements, the items on, let's say, like a link here, this href, that's an attribute. So attribute, and then the element is the whole thing. Okay, so as I'm kind of navigating through here, I'm noticing that this is changing. The reason that's changing is because it's working, the document object model is working together with the CSS object model to build a map of what styles, what CSS rules get applied to each element in the document. So if you notice here, we can see our rule for the color green. If we keep going down, we're eventually going to get to our blanched almond, which is here. And if you notice, it even does this really cool, like, sort of priority change. Am I drawing all that? Oh, okay. It went away. Yeah, so if you notice here, this actually gets crossed out, which is really, really useful when you're building your own web page, because you can understand how the CSS rules that you've written get applied to each individual element. And if any are being overridden by this practice that we just went through, which is applying a style inline, this is called an inline style, to an element specifically, we can see how it's overriding. So it's saying this element specific style, as in we added this style rule for this particular element. It's eliminating the style rule that we had for color on list items with the web resources class. So that's crossed out. This is also a really convenient way to add element specific styles. I'm trying to think of an interesting style that we could add, but we could do like font size.
Hey, you change the font.
Yeah, okay, yeah, let's actually change the font family. Oops. So font family, and let's do Arial. Oh, it actually kind of looks a lot like Helvetica, so that's a bad example. Let's do Times New Roman. Yeah, so you can just say times. And so you can see here, if we zoom in, make it a little more clear. blanched almond. It's not a very obvious font. So let's change that to, what is Gainsborough? Oh, it's just gray. Okay.
Wingdings.
We might be able to do wingdings. I don't know if that's available within the standard, but you can certainly import. No, it doesn't like our wingding. Yeah, I'm afraid I don't think we're going to get away with that one. But another really cool thing you can do is if we check out the documentation for font family, and this is usually the way I navigate documentation. I use the MDN. I actually linked that here on the resources page. And I will be updating this page pretty regularly for any new resources we encounter. But you can see here that some examples of the way that we can use the font family rule. It gives us some syntax. It explains how we can use fonts. And one of the examples it gives us is actually how to import our own font. So if you're not familiar, you can create a TTF file, and you can maybe Google about that outside of this if you're interested in this. But if you made your own font, or you found a font that you liked that wasn't available typically, you can actually include this font with your web page and then link it using this source rule for this special font face attribute. Yeah, and then if you want to learn more about how font face works, you can check that out here. But there should be some examples. Yes, there are. So what you're doing here is essentially making your own font family by giving it a name and then telling it where to find the font file, like the specification for how the font should look. And that's what this does. And so then that way, what you do is you just do like I've done in my code, where I say Helvetica, except in this case, you would refer to your new font that you just made. So that's something kind of cool that you can do. So they're pretty flexible. CSS in general is quite flexible. I think that kind of like wraps it up. I know we're running short on time, so I just want to let anyone know that, feel free to interject with any questions you have, or if you want me to clarify anything before we run out of time completely, feel free to do so now.
Do you want to just maybe just like review what we covered today real quick?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So I think in summary, we talked a little bit about the DOM and kind of understanding the difference between the code that I write for myself in using HTML and sort of the code that I write, and then how it gets shown in a web page. And so the relationship between those two things, or the bridge between those two things, is the DOM here, so the document object model. And then we kind of took a little bit of a tangent into CSS, because I wanted to clarify that while CSS isn't necessarily a very clear part of this, it's still a part of our web pages. And the way that we view our CSS, or the way that the CSS is related to the building of the document on the web page, is through this particular object model, the CSS object model. And then we kind of did a deeper dive into CSS, understanding the cascading aspect of CSS, understanding inherited rules, understanding overrides, and understanding how to create rules using classes and referring to attributes. I think mainly we spend a lot of time talking about the relationship between elements that we specify using HTML. So this is a child of this element. This element is a parent of this child. This is not a child of this element, but a sibling. So I think that about covers everything we talked about. I know we covered a lot of things, and in some ways we didn't seem to really go very far, but hopefully introduced
It's really
you.
great.
Yeah.
One of the times that I've encountered CSS is and that is I find to be actually kind of accessible, which is on like web page builders, for instance, like WordPress, Weebly, Cargo, like these kinds of template based website creators usually allow you to edit the CSS yourself and directly. So if anybody does or has like a site on WordPress or Weebly or something like this, you can usually edit and interact with the CSS as well. So that can be kind of a nice platform for experimenting or familiarizing yourself with some of the language that I've found.
Yeah, I've seen that too. And I think depending on the platform you use, you can even do things like add custom HTML. So definitely, don't think that you have to start from scratch and like create a page with nothing. You can apply a lot of these tools to like these sort of ready-made solutions, like Austin mentioned, Squarespace, Cargo. Um, yeah, you would be ready to modify CSS like this. You could change the font, certain items. You can change color, but hopefully in the next session, I want to get into this sample page that I created, just to give you a taste of it. Get into some hopefully pretty complex CSS, HTML, which will let us do some pretty surprising things that you wouldn't expect to be done with just simple code like this here. So,
The screen is covered in your graffiti page.
is this really my graffiti? I don't.
I don't know who else would be doing it.
Yeah, I. I can't tell how I'm doing it, so I apologize.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's me. I don't think so though. But anyways, I guess if nobody has any other questions or comments, critiques, or anything, we could probably adjourn. We will be meeting next. Uh, we will be meeting in 2 weeks for another session. In the meantime, you can check out the GitHub that Page has. If you don't have a GitHub, I highly recommend making one. It's a great entry point into all things code related. And also, I would like to mention that Page has open office hours Mondays from 6 to 8. We didn't actually write any code tonight, but if you wanted to maybe write some code or go back to some things we covered, or even start from square one and anything you want, basically, you can sign up for open office hours with Paige on, that's every Monday from 6 to 8.